Hello Anatomy, welcome to part 1 of our video series on Chapter 5, the skeletal system. In this video, we will be going through the functions of your skeleton, the types of bones, the anatomy of a bone, and how bones grow. In the second video, we're going to go through actually naming and identifying different bones of your body. So here we go. So again, we're talking about your bones, your skeleton. We're also going to include joints. Cartilage, remember, was a kind of connective tissue that you might find between vertebra or in your rib cage. Ligaments, again, were a type of dense connective tissue that connected bones together. The two subdivisions of your skeleton are called the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton includes your brain and your spinal column and your rib cage. The appendicular skeleton it's basically your arms and your legs. In the second video, when we go through the types of bones, the names of bones, we'll come back to that. So functions of your skeleton, a lot of this is not rocket science. Obviously, it's to support your body. To protect soft organs, so think about like your skull housing your brain, or your rib cage serving as protection for your thoracic cavity, for your heart and your lungs. Your bones also allow for movement because skeletal muscles attached to them. So anywhere on a bone where, think about like your humerus, the end of your humerus are kind of rounded and kind of stick out. Or if you touch the back of your head, there's a little knobby thing there on your skull. Wherever you have spots where bones kind of stick out, that's where muscles attach. If you touch the base of your skull and move your head, you can feel those muscles contracting. So allowing for attachment sites for muscles is another function of bones. They store minerals and fats. In terms of minerals, particularly calcium and phosphorus, which are things that obviously your bones need to be strong, but lots of things in your body, your nerves need calcium to work. So if there's no calcium in your blood, your nerves don't function. So not only do bones store these elements because they need them, but they can release them if your body is running short on them. There's fat inside the internal marrow cavity of your bones that obviously your bones can release this if you need energy. Blood cell formation is called hematopoiesis, so forming like red blood cells, that happens in the marrow of your bones also. So when you think of bones, you think of just being for support. They actually do lots of things for your body. The adult skeleton has 206 bones, so you can sort of classify the types of bones into two types. There's compact bone, and this is a cross section of a bone of your skull. Compact bone would be at the top or the bottom, looks very homogeneous, looks very sort of the same material throughout, although really it's not. And then you have spongy bone, which has these big open spaces. Bone is very, very strong. It's a very, very strong material, but it's also very lightweight. So you want bones to be durable, but you don't want them to be incredibly heavy or your muscle would have a hard time moving your bones. So compact bones tend to be thin, like sheet-like. Spongy bone tends to have these big air spaces to make them lightweight. So in terms of how you classify bones, so there's 4 main categories of bones: long, short, flat, and irregular. We're going to go through each one individually in a minute. Long bones would be like your humerus, a stereotypical bone, like a dog bone as you see it as a long bone. A flat bone might be like your sternum, it's broad and flat. Short bones tend to be kind of cube-shaped or irregularly cube-shaped, typically found in your ankles or your wrist. And irregular bones is basically everything else. Bones that have a very irregular structure, like what's in your backbone, in your vertebra. So let's go through each one at a time. So long bones, again, long in that they're typically longer than they are wide. So typically, long bones have a shaft with a head at both ends, and the heads kind of protrude out for muscle attachment sites. They're mostly compact bone. All of the bones of your limbs, your arms and your legs, except for your wrist, ankle, and your kneecap are long bones. Examples would be your femur in your leg or your humerus in your arm. Short bones, like I said earlier, are typically shaped kind of like irregular cubes. They're mostly spongy bones, so they're pretty lightweight. These would be the bones of your wrist and your ankle. Sesamoid bones, some textbooks call this a 5th category of bones. This would be things like your kneecap, your patella. Sometimes bones can be sort of embedded within tendons in your kneecap. It's not free floating, which I guess no bones are free floating, but it's actually like embedded inside the tendons of your knee. Sesamoid bones are a kind of short bone. Examples again, carpals, tarsals, like in your wrist or your ankles. So flat bones are ones that are thin, flattened, they can be curved sometimes. So typically here you have two thin layers of compact bone with some spongy bone in between. Here, think about like the bones of your skull. They're thin and broad, typically curved. Your ribs, same deal. And your sternum, your breastbone here, these are examples of flat bones. So irregular bones is basically a catch-all category for everything else. These are irregular shaped. Things like your vertebra, things like your hip bones, bones that have, you know, pretty irregular shapes, we just put into one category called irregular bones. Okay, so now we're going to go through the anatomy of a long bone, and we're really only going to do this for long bones because there's kind of like some themes that apply to more than one type of bone, but looking at this in long bone is sort of the easiest way to remember this. So, you know, bones have a shaft. Actually, go back a second. This word diaphysis. So, you know, picture a stereotypical bone. The diaphysis is the shaft of the bone, the long middle part. Epiphysis would be the two ends of the bone. A diaphysis is typically made of compact bone with a medullary cavity in the middle. Epiphyses typically are made of spongy bone. Sometimes they have this thing called the epiphyseal line, which we're going to discuss in just a minute. But again, each end has an epiphysis. You know, the root epi means upon. So the epiphyses are sort of like they're upon the diaphysis. Okay? So this is the same picture it was on the previous slide, just bigger. So let's just look at this before we go through each of these words. So typically at the ends of bones, you have a layer of articular cartilage. It's kind of like a glassy, sort of smooth layer that helps prevent friction from building up inside joints. Here I have the epiphysis. Here you see the spongy bone. The epiphyseal line, so when you are still growing, when you're a toddler or an adolescent, the epiphyseal line is actually called the epiphyseal plate, and it's actually cartilage. And when these bones grow long, we'll see this on another slide in just a minute, the cartilage turns into bone, all right? It kind of pushes the epiphysis away, which makes the bone longer. Once you've reached adulthood, or once you're, you know, towards the end of puberty, the epiphyseal plate turns fully into bone, and what's left is this like little line here called the epiphyseal line. It's sort of like this little layer of compact bone between the spongy bone. It's what some people call their growth plates. And when you see this is fully turned into bone, you know that you're not growing, at least you're not growing tall anymore. So look at the bottom end, you have another epiphysis. So in terms of the diaphysis and what we're looking at here, so the periosteum, remember how organs or your abdominal linings had membranes, going back to chapter 4? The membrane that lines bones is called periosteum. So we have a layer of periosteum, then we have compact bone. Then we have the medullary cavity, which is lined with a membrane called endosteum. And inside that, you might have the marrow, you might have blood vessels or nerves inside the medullary cavity, okay? So this general like scheme for the anatomy of a bone is sort of best seen in a long bone like this. Okay, so some of this I said on the previous slide. The periosteum is a kind of membrane that lines the outside of the diaphysis, of the shaft part of the bone. You know, looking back, between the periosteum and the actual bone, you have what are called perforating or Sharpie's fibers. Let me show you a quick picture. So these are the Sharpie's fibers that they look like a cobweb. These are connective tissue fibers that help secure the periosteum to the bone. And obviously you have arteries, which supply arterial blood, which gives nutrients and such to the bone, okay? Remember the periosteum was the membrane on the outside. The endosteum is the inner lining of the medullary cavity. And here we have yellow marrow and arteries inside the bone. Okay, the articular cartilage, this is the layer of cartilage that we mentioned earlier that's on the ends of the bone, the epiphyses. It's made of hyaline cartilage. Its job is to have a nice glassy, smooth surface so you don't get friction between bones at joints. We've already said this too. The epiphyseal plate was that plate of cartilage seen in bone when you're growing. And once that turns into fully bone, compact bone, you call it the epiphyseal line. That's what we're talking about here. In this case, it's called the epiphyseal line because it's no longer cartilage. Now it's just compact bone. Okay, make sure we said all this. We did. Okay. All right, so the medullary cavity is that cavity inside the shaft of the bone. There's more than one kind of marrow. You know, you've heard of bone marrow before, right? Yellow marrow is mainly what you find in the medullary cavity of a diaphysis in adults. It's mostly just fatty tissue. In an infant, the diaphysis contains red marrow, which is a kind of marrow that makes red blood cells. Once you're an adult, you really only have red marrow in the epiphyses, or the two ends of the long bone. You generally only have yellow marrow in the diaphyses when you're adult. When you're an infant, you can have red marrow in the diaphyses too. Okay. It's the same picture again. So here we have the medullary cavity, and here you can see some yellow marrow. So this is obviously an adult. It's an adult because because you see the epiphyseal line is not cartilage. Okay, so this is a super important slide. So bones, you know, you go to the dollar store and buy a cheap skeleton at Halloween. You know, if you buy a nice expensive skeleton from a science supply company, bones are not smooth, all right? Bones have etchings, they have markings, they have things that stick out, they have holes in them. Like if you look, you know, the base of the skull has this big foramen, this big hole at the bottom where your spinal column comes in. There's also a bunch of little holes in your skull, which is where nerves or blood vessels might go through your skull. So whenever you see a bone marking or a bone surface feature, maybe it's an etching or a hole or a little thing that sticks out, those are sites either for attachments of muscles or maybe tendons or ligaments. You know, if the bone is completely smooth, it's going to be hard for stuff to attach to it. If you see holes in bones, that might be a passage for a nerve or for blood vessels. We'll do several labs in class where we look at different bones and identify the different markings and etchings on the bones and what they do. So, you know, we're going to revisit this more later, but there's lots of different terms to categorize bone markings. Projections or processes are typically things that stick out, all right? You know, like the thing at the base of your skull here, the back of your head, or the ends of your humerus, they are things that stick out, all right? Things that tend to start with T's or P's. So a trochanter, a tuberosity, those are, and again, we're gonna come back to this later. If it begins with a T or a P, it's probably something that sticks out from a bone, all right? Depressions or cavities are holes or indentations. These typically begin with the letter F. So like a foramen or a fossa, that big hole at the bottom of your skull where your spinal column, you know, comes into your brain, that's a hole, that's a foramen. It's called the foramen major because it's a big hole in your body. Things that begin with F's are usually holes or depressions. Things that begin with T's or P's are generally things that stick out. When we do our different labs on bones and we see more of these in detail, you know, we'll come back to this, but for now, just file away. T's and P's stick out, F's stick in, or are holes or cavities. Okay, so we did the anatomy of a long bone. Now let's do the microscopic anatomy of bone. So an osteon or Haversian system, you know, when I was in school, we didn't use the word osteon. We used the word the Haversian system. Nowadays, usually you use the term osteon, but it's really the same thing. Basically, it's sort of like the unit of bone. When we did, in chapter 3, when we did that tissue lab with a microscope and looked at different types of tissues, one of the slides was bone, and you saw, here, I'm gonna skip ahead for a second. You saw what looked kind of like this, with these sort of like concentric circle-like structures that repeat. That's called an osteon. The whole thing is called an osteon, or the Haversian canal. So basically, it's a unit of bone that has what's called a central canal, and then these rings that come out from the center. The central canal is called the Haversian canal, which is why this can be called the Haversian system. Basically, the opening in the center carries nerves and blood vessels. So when you look at a diagram like this, I'll go back to the previous slide in just a minute. You can see this sort of like these canals that come out that are arranged sort of like in concentric circles, and in the middle there might be blood vessels or nerves. All right, let's go back to the previous slide for a second. So again, the central canal is called the Haversian canal. The whole thing is called an osteon. Perforating or Volkmann canals are canals that come sort of like off at right angles. So picture you have two osteons, that are coming out at you. You can have a canal that goes between them that connects them, which can carry blood or nerves between osteons. They're perpendicular to the central canal. Those are called perforating or Volkmann's canals. So here in this picture, you can see here's an osteon. You see a blood vessel. These things that go between the canals, again, are the perforating or Volkmann's canals. Okay. So lacunae and lamellae. So lacunae is basically it's a cavity inside. Let me find one here. Like here's one right here. It's a cavity inside bone that houses the bone cells called osteocytes. Back in chapter 3, we saw the word lacunae, and basically, I said lacunae was basically just like a gap or a place where you have cells. In this case, they're osteocytes because those are cells that make bones. All right. So you have these concentric rings of lacuna. In between them, you have these things called lamellae. Like there's a lamellae or lamella. There's one. And again, they're sort of like concentric rings around the central canal. And within the lamellae are the lacunae spaces that contain osteocytes. Okay. Going back to the slide before, you can see here you have the lamellae and the little like dark, like little raisin-looking things. Those would be lacunae that have osteocytes in them. So a lot of new vocabulary probably. So this is the image I showed you before. This is an actual microscope image. Here you see the central or Haversian canal. Here you see the concentric rings. The lacunae, the ones that look kind of like raisins, are the little gaps that house osteocytes, the cells that form bones. So, going back to this little diagram here. So these are they're in concentric rings, but you can have little like perpendicular little canals that connect the rings together. Those are called canaliculi. It's a fun word to say, or a canaliculus is the singular. So, the different rings are not totally separated. This is it's similar to the idea of a Volkmann or perforating channel from the previous slide, but this is within one osteon. Let's go back a second. The Volkmann's channel connects different osteons, right? The canaliculi connect the rings within a single osteon. Okay, and again, bones can transport nerves, blood. Bones, you think of them as being sort of dry and brittle and unchanging, but bones have a decently rich blood supply. If you break a bone, give it 6, maybe 8 weeks, it's gonna heal. Bones will heal pretty effectively on their own. So the way your skeleton grows, so when you are an embryo, your skeleton's mainly cartilage, mainly hyaline cartilage, because you're growing and cartilage is more flexible. During development, most of that cartilage is replaced by bone. When a baby is first born, parts of the skull, well, in the second video we'll talk about this, are still cartilage, which is why you have the soft spots in a baby's head. That's because when a baby is born, to get the baby's head through the birth canal, the head has to be able to be kind of moldable. Kids that are born, through a vaginal birth versus a C-section kind of have cone heads because the head kind of gets squished when it goes through the birth canal. That's good, so the baby fits, but because it has cartilage, the head can be kind of misshapen. That cartilage, obviously, as an adult, remains in your nose, parts of your ribs, things like your ear, things like your joints. But by the time you're 3 or 4 years old, most of your skeleton is now bone. So these next couple slides, we've already talked about this concept, the idea of epiphyseal plates. So this was the idea here. Let me show you a picture. So here's an embryo. Here's a fetus. Here's a child that's been born. You can see the bone's largely cartilage, and what's left. Say this could be a 10-year-old kid. You have the cartilage at the ends of the bone, which you'll have as an adult too, but you also have this epiphyseal plate, this line. There's two of them, obviously, in a long bone, where the bone can grow lengthwise. All right, let me go back where I was before. So basically, the epiphyseal plate allows for bones to grow longer during childhood. And basically, what's happening here is that, let me show you this in a picture. So if this bone is growing, like the bottom of the plate is where cartilage turns into bone, and the top of the plate is where new cartilage is being formed. So it's like this plate is pushing upward. The bottom part turns into bone. The top part makes more cartilage, which makes the bone grow lengthwise, right? New cartilage is formed, older cartilage is broken down, or it turns into bone. So the word ossified means it turns into bone. We'll come back to this word osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are cells that form new bone, so I can turn cartilage into bone via osteoblast. Okay, when the bone grows, let me show a different picture. I know I'm going way out of order here. Let's see, if you look in this picture, like when this bone grew, it grew longer, but this part here, when the bone was shorter, this was bone that got resorbed, I guess that's a word, resorbed, where bone was broken down to sort of remodel the bone. So when bones grow longer, it's because of the whole deal with the epiphyseal plate. But when bones grow longer too, they do have to change their shape in terms of the girth of the bone too, right? The girth either gets bigger or gets smaller. In this case, when the bone gets longer, the girth here got smaller because the bone got stretched. All right, let me go back to where I was, okay? Okay, cool. So this is kind of what I said. So bones, they both grow and they're remodeled. Different factors that control how a bone grows. So blood calcium levels. Obviously, bones need calcium to grow. All right. But also gravity. Gravity. If a bone is growing, bones tend to. Your body knows what up is and what down is. Your bones will grow stronger if your muscles pull on them a lot. So, people who lift weights or who work out, that does make your muscles bigger for sure, but it also makes your bones stronger because gravity and the pull of muscles on your skeleton also encourages your bones to grow. All right. Bones growing in width is called appositional growth. That was the idea here when the width of the bone changes. The whole deal with the epiphyseal plate was bones growing lengthwise. Appositional growth is when bones grow in girth or in width. Okay, we already saw this diagram, right? Saw that one. So the specific types of bone cells, kids get these words confused all the time. An osteocyte, the word literally means bone cell. An osteocyte is what you call a mature bone cell. Osteoblasts are cells that form more bone. Osteoclasts are cells that break down bone. All right. When bones grow lengthwise, you need osteoblasts to make them grow longer. But when we saw on this slide here, there's an area where you need to break the bone down, and osteoclasts might do that to mold the bone a certain way. Your body also might need osteoblasts. Remember I said earlier how your nerves need calcium. So if your blood calcium is particularly low, your body will give off a hormone called PTH, parathyroid hormone, that will stimulate osteoclasts to break down bone, which will release calcium into your blood for things like your nerves. All right. So think of osteoblasts and osteoclasts working together, one, to form and remold bone, and two, also, like if your blood calcium is high, you want to reabsorb that calcium back into your bone. A hormone called calcitonin does that, whereas PTH is a hormone that causes your bones to release calcium to make your blood calcium go up. When we do chapter 8, which is the endocrine system, we'll talk about how your blood calcium is regulated. For now, just understand the difference between osteoclasts and osteoblasts, and what they each are and what they each do. And they do opposite things, right? So let's wrap it up here. So bone fracture, so a fracture just means a break in the bone. A closed or simple fracture is the break of a bone where the bone does not go through the skin. An open or compound fracture is a fracture where the bone sticks out through the skin. Oftentimes you can just treat broken bones with reduction and immobilization. So Like if a bone is broken, you might, reset the bone so that it's in the right position, and then you immobilize it so it stays that way. And again, give it 6 to 8 weeks, and the bone will heal on its own as long as the ends are in the right configuration. So different types of fractures. A comminuted fracture, this diagram is helpful, is a fracture in which the bone's broken into multiple pieces. A compression is where the bone is crushed. A depression is where the bone is pressed inward, like that one. Bones that are impacted is when the bone's broken and the ends are forced into one another. A spiral break would be a break like here, where the bone kind of got twisted and broken in a twisting motion. A green stick is a fracture, kind of like, if you take a twig and break it, but the twig doesn't totally break apart, it only partially breaks, or the bone is broken in this incomplete manner. So when a bone is broken, the steps that the body goes through, so a hematoma is basically sort of a fancy word for a bruise. So this bone got broken. Notice that the bone's in the right configuration. It just needs to heal. So a hematoma is this sort of blood-filled swelling that's formed. That later gets replaced with fibrocartilage, think back to chapter 3, to form this thing called a callus. Then the fibrocartilage gets replaced by a bony callus, all right, to just heal the break. And by the end, you've remodeled the bone so it looks back to where it was. So basically the patch that you formed sort of hollows out in the middle, so the bone goes back to having that medullary cavity in the middle. Okay, so we're gonna stop there with part 1. Hope that was helpful, and we'll pick up with part 2 later. Bye.